October 1945, southern Indiana, just outside the town of Paoli, where the fields sloped gently and the mornings arrived already cold. Frost clung to the soil like powdered glass, cracking softly under boots that were borrowed, mismatched, and a half size too large. 13-year-old Karl Weiss stood near the edge of a harvested cornfield, shoulders hunched, hands tucked into the sleeves of a wool coat that did not belong to him and never quite warmed through. The wind cut low and steady, slipping through the gaps at his wrists, lifting the thin ends of his hair, carrying the dry rattle of corn stalks left standing like broken teeth. He had crossed an ocean weeks earlier without understanding why, only that the war was over, and the adults had stopped explaining things. Now he stood in America, a place he had imagined as loud and sharp and angry, waiting for something to happen. Around him were other boys, 12, 14, one who said he was 15 but looked younger, all German, all quiet. Their coats varied in color and age, brown, gray, one with a missing button, another patched at the elbow. Each coat looked as though it had been taken from a different life and dropped here without permission. A man stood at the far end of the field near a tractor that smelled of oil and cold metal. He was tall, with a narrow face and a hat pulled low. His name, they would later learn, was Henry Miller. That morning he said very little. His voice was calm, flat, the words shaped carefully as though chosen from a small supply. Work until supper. No talking. He gestured toward the field with a gloved hand, then turned away. Karl did not know what rule mattered more, the silence or the work. He only knew he must not be the one who failed. He believed mistakes were being counted. He believed hunger was part of what was expected of them. His stomach was already tight, a familiar ache he had learned to ignore, but the cold made it sharper. He thought if he slowed, if he looked weak, the coat would be taken away. Warmth felt temporary, like everything else. They moved into the field with short-handled tools, scraping frozen soil from around the last roots, lifting crates, carrying them to the wagon. The handles were rough, the wood worn smooth in places by hands that were not theirs. Breath clouded the air, no one spoke. The only sounds were metal striking stone, boots shifting, the distant creak of the tractor settling. The coats absorbed everything. Cold, sweat, dust, the faint smell of rust. Karl worked with his head down. The sleeves rode up his arms, exposing skin that stung in the wind. He flexed his fingers, feeling them numb, then brought them back inside the wool. The coat was heavier than it looked, the lining stiff, the collar frayed. It smelled faintly of tobacco and something else he could not name. Maybe old rain. He wondered who had worn it before and where that person was now. At mid-morning, Henry Miller walked past the line of boys. His boots left deep prints in the frost. He stopped in front of Karl without warning. Karl's chest tightened. He waited for a correction, a reprimand, something sharp. Instead, Henry reached into his coat and pulled out a pair of cotton gloves. They were white once, now gray at the fingertips. Too large, the seams thick. He held them out. Karl hesitated. He did not know if taking them was allowed. Henry did not speak. He simply kept his hand there. Karl took the gloves. The cotton was dry and rough, but warmer than bare skin. Henry nodded once and moved on. The gloves changed nothing and everything. Karl pulled them on, the fingers folding over themselves. Clumsy. But his hands stopped shaking. He worked faster, not because he was afraid now, but because he could. The coat shifted on his shoulders, settling differently with the added weight of the gloves. For the first time since arriving, he felt something loosen, just a little. Not safety. Confusion. By noon the sun rose higher, but it gave no warmth. Frost lingered in the shadows. The boys worked without pause. Hunger pressed in waves, dull then sharp, then dull again. Karl focused on the rhythm of lifting and setting down, the scrape of the tool, the sound of his own breathing. He did not look up. He did not want to see who might be watching. When the wagon was full, Henry motioned for them to stop. He pointed toward the farmhouse in the distance, white paint chipped, smoke lifting thinly from the chimney. The walk back was slow. The coats were damp now, darkened at the seams. Meltwater dripped from hims. Karl could feel it against his legs. Inside the mudroom, nails lined the wall. Henry gestured again. The boys removed their coats, one by one, hanging them carefully. The air smelled of wet wool and earth. Karl watched as Henry counted them, touching each sleeve, each collar, as if checking inventory. When Karl's turn came, he hesitated before letting go. The coat was heavier now, warm from his body, familiar already. He hung it on the nail and stepped back. They were led to the barn, given water, then sent to sit on overturned crates. No one spoke. The rules still held. Karl wrapped his arms around himself. Without the coat, the cold returned quickly. He wondered if he would get it back in the morning, or if something he had done wrong would be discovered overnight. As the afternoon wore on, the sky dulled. Somewhere inside the house, a door closed. A pot was set down hard enough to be heard even from the yard. The sound carried. It landed in Karl's chest and stayed there. He did not know why. When they were dismissed for the day, the coats were returned, handed out in the same order they had been taken. Karl slid his arms back into the wool. It was stiff now, colder than before. But it was his again, for this night at least. He pulled it tight and followed the others toward the long building where they slept. He lay awake that night listening to the wind push against the walls, the coat folded under his head like a pillow. He did not know what this place was yet, or what it would ask of him next. He only knew that the coat had stayed, and that meant something, though he could not yet say what. November 1945, the same Indiana fields outside Paoli, colder now. The ground locked hard enough that the metal tips of the tools rang when they struck. Frost no longer vanished by mid-morning. It clung stubbornly to the shaded rows, glittering under a pale sun that offered light without comfort. Karl Weiss stepped into his coat before dawn, the wool stiff from drying overnight, the collar rough against his neck. He buttoned it wrong the first time because his fingers ached, then fixed it, breathing slowly until the pain dulled. The boys lined up without being told. Silence had become a habit, as instinctive as keeping their eyes lowered. Karl no longer wondered if the rule was real. He believed in it completely. Silence felt safer than guessing. Speaking would remind the farmers of who they were, where they came from, what language lived in their mouths. Hunger had learned to wait inside him, a constant pressure as steady as the cold. Henry Miller was already there, leaning against the tractor, steam rising faintly from a mug held in both hands. He nodded once, the signal to begin. No speech, no announcement, just work. The boys moved out across the field, coats buttoned tight, collars turned up. Their breath puffed white and disappeared. The tools were colder now. Handles burned the skin even through gloves. Karl scraped and lifted, his shoulders rounding inward as if to protect what little heat the coat held. The cotton gloves Henry had given him weeks earlier were threadbare at the fingertips. He kept them anyway. They smelled faintly of soap and iron. He worked until his back tightened and his stomach twisted sharply enough to make him pause. He did not stop. He had learned that time moved faster if he didn't notice it. The silence grew heavier as the days shortened. It pressed down like an extra layer of clothing, invisible but exhausting. Karl listened to everything because there was nothing else to do. The scrape of tools, the distant bark of a dog, the faint whistle of wind through bare branches. When a boy coughed, the sound startled them all. At 4 each afternoon, something changed. Not the work. The rules still held. But the air itself shifted. From the farmhouse, the smell would come first. Onions hitting hot fat. Water warming. Sometimes carrots. Sometimes only broth. The scent drifted low and steady across the yard, catching in the wool of their coats. Karl felt it settle into the fabric, clinging long after the wind moved on. He found himself breathing deeper without meaning to, pressing his face briefly into his sleeve when he thought no one was looking. Mrs. Miller appeared in the doorway occasionally, wiping her hands on her apron, checking the sky. Her name was Ruth. Karl knew this because he had heard Henry say it once. She never spoke to the boys during work. She simply watched, then went back inside. The door would close. The smell would thicken. One afternoon, the cold sharpened suddenly. The wind picked up, cutting sideways across the field. Karl's footing slipped on a frozen ridge he hadn't seen. His boot slid. His weight shifted wrong. And he stumbled forward. The tool clattered against the ground. For a moment, the silence shattered inside his head. He waited for it to happen. Henry was there before Karl fully fell. A hand closed around his elbow, firm and steady, stopping the drop. No yank. No shove, just balance returned. Henry did not look angry. He did not speak. He let go and walked on. Karl stood frozen, heart racing, heat flooding his face despite the cold. He picked up the tool and kept working. But something had cracked. The fear did not disappear. It shifted, just slightly, like ice loosening on a river. When the day ended, they were led back toward the house. The coats came off in the mudroom, hung on the nails in their careful row. Meltwater dripped onto the wooden floor, darkening it in small, spreading circles. Karl's hands shook as he unlaced his gloves. Without the coat, the cold rushed back in, sharp and immediate. They were led into the kitchen for the first time. The room was warm, the air thick with steam. A pot sat on the stove, lid rattling softly. Bowls were already set out on the table, mismatched, chipped at the edges. Karl had not seen a table set like this in years. He did not know where to stand. Henry waited until everyone was inside. He closed the door. The silence stretched, taut as wire. Then he nodded once, the same gesture he used to start work, and said, "You can talk now." The words landed strangely, like something dropped into deep water. No one spoke at first. Karl's throat tightened. He was not sure his voice would work. He took a bowl when one was handed to him, feeling the heat seep into his palms. The broth was thin but hot. Onions floated at the surface. Steam rose and fogged his eyes. Someone laughed, a short, surprised sound, then clamped a hand over their mouth. Another boy said his name out loud, softly, as if testing it. Karl whispered his own. It sounded different here. He ate slowly, afraid it would end if he rushed. This was not the moment they would remember forever, though it felt important. That came later. For now, there was only warmth, voices returning in fragments, and the coats hanging by the door, dripping quietly, as if listening. December 1945. Snow arrived before anyone expected it, blanketing the Indiana fields in a clean white layer that muffled sound and erased the hard lines of the land. The air turned sharper, brittle enough to sting the inside of the nose. Karl Weiss stepped into his coat each morning with practiced movements, shrugging it up onto his shoulders, buttoning it carefully, feeling the familiar weight settle. The wool had grown darker along the seams, polished by weeks of wear. It no longer felt borrowed. It felt assigned. Work continued as it always had. No guards, no raised voices, just tasks repeated day after day. The boys spoke now while they worked, quietly at first, then with more ease. Names passed between them. Ages, small details. One had a sister in Hamburg. Another remembered a river that froze solid enough to skate on. Their words rose and fell with the scrape of tools and the crunch of boots in snow. Karl learned, almost by accident, that the coat he wore had belonged to Henry Miller's older son. The name came up one afternoon when Karl asked about a missing button. Henry paused, then said it plainly, without ceremony. The son had worn it before the war. After, until it no longer fit into the life that came back. The coat had been folded and put away. Now it was here. Karl did not know what to do with that information. He felt it press into him, heavier than the wool. The coat was not a uniform. It was not a rule. It was memory. He worked the rest of the day in silence, his own thoughts loud enough to drown out everything else. Time moved in short, repetitive stretches. Snow fell, melted, froze again. The boys grew stronger. Hunger dulled, though it never vanished. Their hands learned the tools. Their backs straightened. Karl noticed small changes. His gloves finally tore through at the fingertips. Ruth replaced them with another pair without comment. One morning, a loose button dangled from Karl's coat. He tried to tie it himself and failed. That afternoon, Ruth called him into the kitchen. He stood stiffly while she stitched the button back on, her fingers rough, movements careful and sure. The needle flashed in and out of the wool. Karl stared at a crack in the floorboard, unsure where to look. The thread pulled the coat tighter, fitting him properly for the first time. When she was done, she patted the fabric once and turned away. Something settled then. Karl realized his fear had been wrong. No one was waiting to punish him. No test was being scored. The coat no longer meant exposure. It meant being expected to return tomorrow. When the news came that they would soon leave the farm, it arrived without drama, a date. Instructions. The boys reacted in different ways. Some were relieved. Some afraid. Karl felt a hollow open in his chest that surprised him with its depth. That night, he folded the coat carefully, smoothing the wool, pressing the creases flat. He slept with it beside him, afraid it would disappear like everything else had. The real shock came later, when Henry told him to keep it. Karl stood in the mudroom, the coat in his hands, the nails empty. He did not understand at first. Henry repeated himself, slower. The words did not change. Karl nodded because it seemed expected. He carried the coat with him when he left, its weight steady against his arm, not knowing yet how far it would travel with him. April 1987. Southern Indiana again. The road narrower than Karl Weiss remembered. The fields gentler, stitched with early green instead of frost. He was 55 now, taller only in posture, his hair thinned and grey at the temples, his hands steady in a way they had not been when he was 13. Spring had softened the land. The air smelled of damp earth and cut grass. Birds moved freely where silence had once ruled. Karl parked the rental car beside the familiar white farmhouse, paint newly laid, the porch steps rebuilt, but recognizable all the same. In the back seat sat his suitcase, scuffed at the corners, heavier than it should have been. Inside, folded carefully, was the coat. The wool was thinned now, patched twice, the lining worn smooth. It carried a faint, stubborn scent of old soup and cold mornings, a smell that had followed him across decades and borders. He had almost left it behind. Almost. But some objects do not allow that. Karl stood for a moment before getting out of the car, listening. No tractor. No wind-scraping corn stalks. Only the soft hum of insects and the distant sound of a truck passing on the highway. He lifted the coat from the suitcase and draped it over his arm, feeling its familiar weight, lighter than it once was, but unchanged in shape. His heart beat faster than he expected. The door opened before he knocked. A woman stood there, middle-aged, her hair pulled back, eyes searching his face. She smiled slowly, carefully, as if matching something she had been told to what she now saw. She said her name was Ellen, Henry Miller's daughter. Her voice carried the same calm, measured tone he remembered from her father. Karl nodded. He did not trust his voice yet. He held out the coat instead. Ellen's hands closed around it with care, as though it were fragile. She did not ask questions. She stepped aside and let him in. The kitchen was smaller than Karl remembered, or perhaps he was simply larger now. The stove had been replaced. The table was new. But the hooks by the door were still there, set into the same beam, polished by decades of use. Light came through the window at the same angle, catching dust in the air. For a moment, time folded inward, quiet and complete. They sat. They did not talk much. They did not need to. Karl placed the coat over the back of a chair, the way he had learned to do as a boy, smoothing it once without thinking. Ellen watched him do it. Her eyes softened. She poured coffee. The mug was warm in his hands. He wrapped his fingers around it and felt the heat seep in slowly. They spoke in fragments. Dates. Names. Ellen told him when her parents had passed. Karl nodded, absorbing it without surprise. He had known, somehow. Loss had a way of arriving before the news did. He told her where he had lived, what he had done. Accounting. A family. A quiet life built piece by piece. The coat had moved with him, from closet to closet, city to city, always folded, never discarded. After a while, Ellen asked if he would like to see the fields. They walked outside together. The land sloped the same way it always had. Karl stood at the edge and looked out. He could see himself there, smaller, hunched, breath white in the air. He could hear the scrape of tools, the steady rhythm of work. He could feel the coat stiff with cold, then warm again. He realized then that the coat had never really been about survival, though that was how it began. It had been about being expected, about continuity, someone assuming he would return, someone leaving space for him to do so. That understanding settled quietly, without drama, the way important things often do. When it was time to leave, Karl lifted the coat from the chair. Ellen hesitated, then nodded. It was still his. Some things, once given, did not need to be returned. He folded it carefully and placed it back in his suitcase. They stood in the doorway together for a moment, the afternoon light stretching long across the floor. Karl walked to the car slowly. He did not rush. The coat rested beside him on the seat as he drove away. The road unspooling ahead, familiar and new all at once. He did not look back. Some warmth lasts longer than the winter it was made for. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to sit with it. And if you want to keep walking through histories like this, you know where to find the next one.